All right, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third New York Seafood and Aquaculture Office Hours. Today's office hours will focus on foodborne illness outbreak and investigations in New York. I'd like to remind everyone that the goal of these sessions is to foster a collaborative and inclusive environment, so we ask all participants to be mindful of time and use respectful language. Please keep your contributions focused on the topic presented today, and if you have other topics of interest, we encourage you to share them in the session evaluation, and we'll do our best to address them during future office hours. We welcome open dialogue, but kindly ask that participants refrain from off-topic and disruptive behavior. We aim to make today's session and all future office hours informative and valuable for everyone. Because this is set up as a Zoom session or Zoom meeting, all participants do have the option to share audio and video, but we kindly ask that you keep your audio muted unless you're actively asking a question during the Q&A towards the end. You can turn on and off your audio and video using the camera and microphone icons in the Zoom window, as shown on this slide. We welcome you to share questions in the chat at any time and ask that you raise your hand using the react icon and wait to be called on if you'd like to ask your question out loud. With that, I'd like to kick off today's session by passing the screen to today's speaker, David Nicholas, who's a chief epidemiologist with the New York State Department of Health.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone had a wonderful time, and I always love talking about foodborne disease outbreaks right after lunch because it always gives you something to look forward to. So I will try to share my screen here and we'll get started. My basic presentation is going to be about foodborne disease outbreaks and foodborne surveillance in New York State in general. However, I've got plenty of slides here that I want to tie into aquaculture and the seafood industry. And then we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So feel free to hold on to your questions, or if you need to interrupt me, that's fine too. I work very well both ways. So hopefully you all can see my screen with my slide, correct? All right, yes. I see some heads nodding. Thank you. All right. And there we go. So basically, to give you a little outline, I'm going to give you a little background of foodborne disease surveillance in New York State, and we'll have some time for questions. When we're doing foodborne disease illness investigations, there's many different ways that we can do them. But one of the reasons why we do them is because each year we roughly see 48 million illnesses, 128,000 hospitalizations, and 3,000 deaths that are estimated each year across the United States associated with foodborne illness. So what is a foodborne disease outbreak? Well, foodborne disease outbreak used to use the acronym FBDO, is defined as the occurrence of 2 or more cases of a similar illness resulting from the ingestion of a common food in the United States. One thing you'll notice is that this definition does not have to say they have to be from a different household. There are some states that do require them to be from a different household. And the perfect example I give all the time is a Vibrio parahemolyticus outbreak, where a husband and wife go out to dinner and they consume raw shellfish, have their nice raw oysters, and the next morning they wake up with vomiting or diarrhea or some sort of gastrointestinal symptom. And sure enough, they've got Vibrio parahemolyticus. Well, they're from the same household. So it doesn't really matter, because you could still, as long as you have that same exposure, you could still meet the definition of a foodborne outbreak. And that is what we practice in New York State, is the same definition as the CDC. Prior to 1992, there were some exemptions to this definition. A single case of marine toxin intoxication or chemical intoxication or botulism was considered an outbreak prior to 1992. However, this definition changed in 1992, so you need 2 or more cases in order to be considered a foodborne outbreak. That does not mean that we do not, that does not mean we do not investigate the single cases. We do. If there is a single case of botulism, we're going to investigate it right away and treat it as if it is an outbreak. But in order to meet the definition of an outbreak, there needs to be 2 or more cases. So when we talk about outbreak investigations, we want to make sure we do what we call a 3-legged stool approach. It involves environmental health, epidemiology, and laboratory. All 3 need to work together, and each one has a little bit different of a job to do. Environmental health may visit and conduct evaluations on site. They may review food preparation practices. They may conduct staff interviews. They may collect food and environmental samples or implement interventions. Epidemiology staff may establish case definitions, design questionnaires, run some data, run some statistics, collect stool specimens, develop curves to kind of look at what is actually happening. And then the laboratory, we need their help in order to analyze samples. One of the big functions of all three of these is communication, and communication is key whenever we investigate a foodborne illness or foodborne disease outbreak. We always want to work together, communicate, collaborate, and coordinate are the 3 C's that I like to go by. In New York State, this is a list of communicable disease outbreak reporting, communicable disease case reporting requirements. And these are basically a list of all the cases that are mandated to be reported to New York State. Some of these require immediate reporting through a phone call. That's why they're in red. And you'll see several that are on this list that I'm sure you're familiar with. One thing that is on this list is foodborne illness, and that's technically foodborne illness in general. So anytime there is a foodborne illness that is diagnosed or identified by a medical provider, that needs to be reported to the State Department of Health. So when we investigate foodborne disease outbreaks, there's 2 major ways that we learn of these outbreaks. One is what we call the complaint-driven outbreak, which on your screen should have like a pink background, and the other we call is a lab-driven outbreak, which has a white background. So the complaint-driven outbreak are those typical examples where somebody believes they got sick from eating food and they call and file a complaint. What happens in New York State is we have local health departments, we have district offices, and we have regional offices, and then we work with other state and federal partners. Our local health departments are the lead on foodborne illness investigations. In order to work on the investigations and for us to assist, local health departments work through what we call our regional office. The regional office is kind of a midway communication point between the local health department and my staff and other staff that work with me here in central office. Once the local health department notifies the regional office notifies central office, and then we work and help them coordinate and assist with the investigation. New York State also has what we call district offices. There are 9 state district offices in New York State. And those are district offices that are throughout the state that basically conduct the environmental health services for certain rural counties that do not have an environmental health program. For example, if we think of Washington County and Warren County out up north in our capital area region further up north, they report to the Glens Falls district office. So food service establishments there would be under regulation of our state district office. So if a local health department receives a complaint, like we said, they communicate with our regional office, who communicates with central office. We help them investigate and then work with our other state and federal partners, such as New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, as well as with our FDA and USDA counterparts. Now, the other side of foodborne illness investigations involves what we call laboratory-driven process. And this is where somebody gets sick, they provide a stool specimen, they go to their doctor, they get that stool tested, and then we find out that they have salmonella or E. coli or campylobacter or whatever pathogen that they have. Well, that normally gets reported from the local lab to our state lab, and usually it should get sent from the local lab to the state lab for further testing. And then the state lab notifies us here at central office, and then we determine, okay, what did we learn or what do we know? And are there other cases around that same area or same location? If we get what we call whole genome sequencing data, do we have other bacteria that are identical match to this person that we want to investigate other cases associated with? Once we determine whether or not we have an outbreak, we'd investigate that outbreak, and then that gets reported to CDC. So one of the first outbreaks I actually worked on, and some of you may have heard this story, unfortunately, is a party that was held at a local family, and they purchased food from a store and they served it at their house. So we got a phone call that, hi, I held a party where I purchased food from, store XYZ. I served it at my house and half the people are saying they got sick. So this was literally one of the first investigations that I ever worked on. And what I found out, we had 15 people ill. There was 33 people that attended and 32 of them consumed food. So we had to develop a questionnaire, identify what people ate, identify what food people brought, First, what we did was we took their 3-day food history and determined what food did they consume in the past 3 days. And then we found out that, yes, they all had this party in common. So we developed a questionnaire based on the menu. Well, it was a christening party that they went to. So one of the questions I had was, did you receive communion? So did you receive the body of Christ? And when I ran the numbers and did the statistics on that, if I had to blame the body of Christ on this foodborne illness, I was afraid where I'd end up after life. So I tried to, look at my numbers real closely. And what we determined was, sure enough, it wasn't the food that they actually bought from the store that got people sick. It was the handling of the food at their own home. And this mother that prepared the food item basically rolled the deli meats with their bare hands, and she had diarrhea the day before. So it's always sometimes not always the last meal that you ate, or not always what you think it is that got you sick, but you have to dig a little deeper and find out how foods were handled, how are they prepared. So now we're going to look at foodborne disease outbreak data in New York State from 1980 to 2021. So here you'll see a list of all the foodborne disease outbreaks in New York State. I've got some arrows here that kind of show some significant drops and significant things that may have happened. One of the things that we want to demonstrate is if you see this big drop here in 1993. Prior to 1993, we mentioned that, it was technically prior to 1992, that single incidents were foodborne disease outbreaks. We kind of removed those from that period just so that it could be equal all across. So we use the definition of 2 or more cases in order to be a foodborne disease outbreak for all this slide set. But in the early 80s and early 90s, we saw a lot of foodborne disease outbreaks associated with shellfish. We saw a lot of outbreaks associated with salmonella and enteritidis in eggs. And we saw a lot of issues with food handling. In 1993, we see this big drop because in 1992, that's when no bare hand contact was put into place in New York State. You cannot handle your ready-to-eat foods with your bare hands anymore in New York State after 1992. Once that law was implemented and once it was put forth and enforced, we saw this big drop in foodborne disease outbreaks after that time period. In 2003, we have no idea why there was that drop, but one of the things that I say is that was the year I started working in this office in food protection. So I don't know if people were afraid to call me or afraid to reach out or thought I was going to make them fill out all these forms, but for some reason we did see a drop in 2003. In 2009, we saw another big drop in foodborne disease outbreaks, and you'll see a large drop in 2020 as well. What happened in 2009? If you think about it, or think to yourselves, that was H1N1. That was where we had the big flu pandemic. And in 2020, I'm sure it's fresh in everyone's mind, is that's when COVID happened. So when we see these big pandemics that we deal with, we tend to see a drop in our foodborne disease outbreaks. Why is that? Is it a lack of resources? We were all investigating the outbreaks as soon as we, heard of them. Were they not being reported to us? That's a possibility. I know during 2009, when the influenza outbreak was happening, was people that had gastrointestinal illness were being told, oh, you have the flu. So maybe it wasn't the flu that they had. Maybe they really had a foodborne illness, but they were being followed up and treated as if they had the flu. So if we look at the burden of foodborne disease outbreaks over a 15-year time span, a majority of our foodborne outbreaks from 2007 to 2021, and this is our most recent data that we have finalized is 2021. That's why we stop at that point. Majority of the outbreaks were norovirus or calicivirus, which was 31.5%. The second highest pathogen that we identified in foodborne outbreaks during this 15-year time span was salmonella. The agents that are most commonly identified in foodborne outbreaks hospitalization cases are salmonella and E. coli that is Shiga toxin reducing. So a large percentage of our hospitalized cases from foodborne outbreaks are associated with salmonella outbreaks. On the bottom here, we talk about outbreaks with a confirmed etiology. So we're able to confirm the agent that caused the foodborne disease outbreak in more than 65% of our outbreaks. Those that had a suspected etiology were around 11%, and those that had an unknown etiology were around 24%. If we look at the foodborne outbreaks etiology by New York State, a majority of our outbreaks during this time period were caused by bacteria. followed by the unknown pathogen, as well as viral. So we notice that unknown and viral are very close and they're neck to neck. And what we see also sometimes, we're going to talk about that in some of the other slides, is that we see salmonella and norovirus that are often one or two most common outbreaks that we see. Now, why are so many outbreaks unknown or have an unknown agent? A lot of it has to do with, by the time we find out about them, people don't want to literally poop in a cup. They don't want to provide their stool specimen. They don't want to participate in the investigation. When they make their complaint, that's it. They don't want to do anymore. They don't want to get involved. They don't want to be interviewed. However, they still meet the definition, or we still find out, yes, we had an outbreak at this place because there's 20 people that are reporting they got sick from this restaurant and they had common food items that weren't common. However, because they don't want to provide a stool specimen, that's one of the issues. There's often a delay in reporting where we don't have food samples. And then there's also outbreaks that we deal with where we really can't test a food item. We don't have the protocols in order to test. We can't test food items for norovirus in New York State. We don't have the capacity at our lab yet. We can't test, shellfish for Vibrio. Unfortunately, we don't have that capacity yet either. But those are some of the minor issues that we deal with, where we may have some outbreaks where we know the food that caused them sick, or we know the establishment, but we just don't know the etiology. So again, a majority of our outbreaks during this time period were caused by a bacteria. This is another way of just looking at the data where we'll see it each year, and we could see some spikes or certain spikes where we've had a spike in bacterial outbreaks versus viral outbreaks. Some of the things, we've noticed is during that time span where we had the spike in bacterial outbreaks, we had warmer summers. Where we had the spike in viral outbreaks, we had colder winters. And we tend to see, a lot more bacterial outbreaks in the summer and a lot more viral outbreaks in the winter, which is something we see here. With our unknown, if you see the unknown, the known is often a similar pattern to our viral outbreaks. A majority of our outbreaks with an unknown etiology, if you look at them and you look at the incubation periods, you look at the symptoms and the symptomology, they fit that viral pattern and they look like they're norovirus, but we just don't have the stool specimens to prove it. So if you look at the top 10 foodborne outbreaks by agent during this time span in this 15 years, like we said, norovirus was number 1. Salmonella was number 2. Scambertoxin was number 3. So scambertoxin is the third highest pathogen that we identify in foodborne outbreaks in New York State. E. coli Shiga toxin positive was number 4, and then Campylobacter was number 5. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the first 3, this calicivirus, salmonella, and scambertoxin, since we know those are often associated with shellfish as well. So norovirus, the incubation period is usually 24 to 48 hours. The symptoms that are involved are often nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, myalgia, headache, or low-grade fever. Severity of illness is not that much. Possible source of norovirus is often human or human feces. And the possible contributing factors associated with calicivirus or norovirus is usually infected people touching ready-to-eat foods, harvesting shellfish from sewage or polluted waters, and then using contaminated water is often associated with norovirus. Salmonella, on the other hand, we've seen salmonella outbreaks associated with many different food items, poultry, eggs, raw milk. The typical incubation period for salmonella is 6 to 72 hours. It can range from 18 to 36 hours. There are some reports of the incubation periods being much longer. Symptoms associated with salmonella are abdominal pain, diarrhea, chills, fever, vomiting, nausea, and possible contributing factors. We often see temperature issues or storing foods at room temperature, holding foods at warm temperatures, preparing food several hours before cooking. Cross-contamination is often an issue with salmonella as well. Scambertoxin is the one that causes histamine poisoning, or also known as scombroid poisoning. We tend to see a lot of it in New York State. The incubation period can range from a few minutes to an hour. Symptoms usually involve headache, dizziness, vomiting, burning throats, facial flushing, diarrhea, nausea. The possible sources of scambertoxin are often tuna, mackerel, Pacific dolphin, bluefish. Cheese has always been listed. I've been doing this 22 years now, and I've yet to see a foodborne outbreak of scambertoxin associated with cheese. Possible contributing factors involves inadequate cooling, improper refrigeration of the fish, or improper curing of cheese. So now if we look at the foodborne outbreaks with a known etiology, and we're showing these year by year because I kind of wanted to show you this trend. Like we said, toxin is in the top three there. In 2017, Salmonella was outbeating calicivirus. In 2018, again, Salmonella was outbeating calicivirus, and toxin again was number three. In 2019, we see this change here where we see calicivirus is outbeating Salmonella. Then we see 2020. And we've got Salmonella is kind of keeping around the same time period or the same trend, I'm sorry. And we had 10 outbreaks of Salmonella, but we only had one norovirus outbreak in 2020. And 2021, again, similar Salmonella is up there again. And norovirus is, we only had two calicivirus outbreaks. Remember we talked about what was the big difference we saw in 2020 was COVID. And so what was happening during this time period? And we saw that we're still getting our Salmonella outbreaks. We're still seeing food coming in contaminated, food likely being temperature issues, but we didn't have those issues of people working while they're sick during COVID because everybody was home. People were excluded for 14 days instead of, just one day. People were wearing gloves, were washing their hands, were cleaning, disinfecting, sanitizing. So those human hygiene issues that we normally see associated with norovirus were kind of, being controlled by us being prepared or trying to prepare ourselves for COVID. So we just thought that was interesting. And that's kind of why I wanted to show these slides year by year and show the difference really in 2020 and 2021. Here we have points of contamination. And basically we wanted to show here is that there are several different points of contamination that we see during the food processing or the food production chain. Production usually occurs on the farm. So we want to look at different areas where contamination may have occurred in order to identify where's the likely source of food being contaminated. So like we said, production usually occurs on the farm. We want to look at where plants are grown or where animals are grown or where they're harvested and not technically grown, but where they're kept, how are they handled. We want to look and see, what's being used for irrigation. You want to look at processing. You want to look at distribution. How are products being distributed? One of my favorite outbreaks was an outbreak associated with ice cream that had pasteurized milk. Well, how is this pasteurized product cause people salmonella? Well, what happened was it went into a distribution tanker that even though it was pasteurized, the tanker used to transport raw eggs. It was transporting raw eggs in liquid format and it wasn't cleaned and sanitized properly. So during the distribution process is when that contamination got introduced. You could also have contamination at the restaurant level or at the retail level at the grocery stores. So we always want to look for the issues with contamination during these different steps of the food production chain. So when we're looking at foodborne disease outbreaks in New York State, with the top 10 contributing factors, we see the first one is unknown because sometimes we're not able to identify the contributing factor. However, a majority of our outbreaks are associated with contaminated ingredients. The products coming in contaminated already. Infected person is another large contributing factor. And here we have bare hand contact or hand contact with implicated food as a separate contributing factor. All 24 of those incidents are part of the 105 infected person outbreaks. The reason why they may differ is because not every outbreak where there's an infected person are we able to identify the bare hand contact. The other reason is that if you have an infected person, you may have other forms of contamination as well. They may have contaminated the actual utensil, which then contaminated the food. They may have contaminated their gloves, which contaminated the food. So there may be different factors involved there. Natural toxicant, you'll see here is the third known contributing factor or the fourth on this list that's associated with foodborne outbreaks during this time period. Here you'll see specific contributing factors identified in bacterial outbreaks. And the reason we want to show this, you'll see there's a number of different factors that can apply to bacterial outbreaks. A lot of them have to do with food coming in contaminated and temperature issues or hand contact, unclean equipment, meaning there's issues with cross-contamination. So there's multiple factors that often apply during bacterial outbreaks. Viral outbreaks, on the other hand, there's very few factors that we see. Most of them are associated with the infected person. which includes the hand contact. There may be some other factors involved. We do see viral outbreaks associated with contaminated ingredients or consumption of raw, lightly heated animal origin. So we have very few limited factors that are involved in viral outbreaks when in comparison to bacterial outbreaks. When we look at the method of preparation of foodborne disease outbreaks in New York State, a majority of our foodborne disease outbreaks are associated with cook served foods. Those are foods that are going to be cooked and served right away. Foods eaten raw or lightly cooked is the second highest or method of preparation for foods associated with foodborne outbreaks in our state. And that could mean anything from, shellfish, eating sushi, eating salads that are technically eaten raw. Somebody that orders something that's, served rare or medium rare or to that which is lightly cooked. Sometimes we see outbreaks associated with steaming of shellfish because sometimes the steaming doesn't cook thoroughly, and that would also be in there. The top 10 significant ingredients of foodborne outbreaks during this 15-year time span in New York State. Well, obviously, there's the one where we don't identify the specific ingredient because we're not able to get a lot of data sometimes when people aren't cooperative. But the number one significant ingredient in New York State in foodborne outbreaks is finfish. And that's often tied to our scombrotoxin outbreaks. So we see a lot of outbreaks associated with finfish as well as scombrotoxin in New York State. It outbeats poultry, it outbeats beef. So we talked about, salmonella and norovirus being our number one pathogen. Well, when we identify scombrotoxin, it's easy to identify what food is implicated because we know we're looking for that fish, we're looking for the tuna, we're looking for those types of fish, and we often find it because that's what the people recall eating. However, a lot of our salmonella outbreaks or E. coli outbreaks or a lot of our norovirus outbreaks, we don't have the significant ingredient because we don't know the food item. So there's a lot of those times, but where we do know the food item, that's kind of why finfish pops up much higher as the number one known significant ingredient to foodborne outbreaks in New York State. So we're going to shift gears here and focus a little bit more on the seafood. I think this is what a lot of you, want to see or want to know or want to hear about. And these are the top 5 etiologies associated with seafood outbreaks in New York State from 2007 to 2021. As we mentioned, scombrotoxin is number 1. We had 49 outbreaks during this time period. Ciguatera was number 2 with 13 outbreaks. Vibrio perihemolyticus was 3rd with 9 outbreaks. Salmonella was 4th with 6 outbreaks, and calicivirus was tied for 4th with 6 outbreaks during this time period. So we talked about salmonella, we talked about calicivirus, we talked about scombrotoxin. So the two we didn't talk about were ciguatera and Vibrio perihemolyticus. And when I first got into doing foodborne illness and foodborne outbreaks, I was intrigued by ciguatera because it always, I never wanted it, believe me, and I don't think I'm going to eat barracuda because I don't want to get it. But it always intrigued me how you get that reverse sensation of whatever, you touch that's supposed to be hot feels cold, or whatever you're supposed to touch that's cold feels hot. But ciguatera is often caused by ciguatera poisoning. The incubation period usually ranges from 3 to 6 hours. It may go up to 30 hours. The symptoms include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal cramps, numbness or tingling in the fingers, toes, or mouth, excessive sweating or headache, weakness or fatigue, dizziness, hallucinations, itching, reversal of temperature sensations in the mouth. So those are some of the common symptoms associated with ciguatera. And possible source are tropical reef fish, such as barracuda, grouper, amberjack, red snapper, moray eel. And the possible contributing factors are often consuming fish that have accumulated the ciguatoxin. Ciguatoxin cannot be destroyed by freezing or cooking affected fish. Sorry for that typo there. And then Vibrio perihemolyticus, as we know, causes vibriosis. The incubation period is around 4 to 96 hours, typically around 12 hours. Symptoms include watery diarrhea, stomach cramps, nausea, vomiting, fever, and chills. The possible source are contaminated marine fish, often shellfish. And the possible contributing factors involved are consuming raw, undercooked marine fish or shellfish, particularly oysters, are highly involved with Vibrio perihemolyticus. So that gives you a little bit of background on those. This slide here basically we want to show you how we do Vibrio surveillance and the communication of a Vibrio case. As I mentioned, we investigate, certain cases, and especially Vibrio, as soon as we find out about them. And with Vibrio in general, it involves a long process and a large process of an investigation. So here, basically, what often happens is our local health department would identify or learn from a local lab that there's a positive case of Vibrio. So the local health department investigates all positive Vibrio, and they report any shellfish exposure, any technically seafood exposure to their regional office. So the regional office would then notify us here at central office of this Vibrio case associated with the seafood exposures. We have staff here at central office on both the epidemiology level and the environmental health level that review each case that comes in and review the seafood exposure data. And then we determine what are our next steps. Some of those next steps could be if the exposure is out of state, we then are going to work on the environmental investigation with that state and see if we need to get shellfish tags, invoices, see if we need to get receipts, purchase history information, whatever we can find to identify what this person ate, get a good interview with them, and then work with our other counterparts in order to do that investigation. If it happens within our state, we work very closely with our New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, as well as with our New York State Department of Agriculture Markets. We do have an MOU with them that's been in existence for several years. And so if it does happen within state, our central office notifies the others, the other partners, the other state partners, and we would work with them in order to do trace back and any sort of investigation that we need to do. What's tricky is with some of these places is, making sure they have their tags, making sure they have invoices. The hardest part of some of our investigations, I know we don't do much with it, but our counterparts at DEC often do the trace back, is trying to read some of these tags. Some of the ones we've seen have terrible handwriting that we really can't identify the source. But in New York State, like I said, we work very closely with our Department of Agriculture Markets and Department of Environmental Conservation, who would conduct the trace back on the shellfish, the trace back on the investigation. We share that trace, but they will share that trace back information with us here at central office. And we then work with our EPI program to complete the final case report. In the United States, or, the CDC puts out what they call the COVID form, the cholera and other Vibrio illness, I believe it's surveillance form. We in New York State use our own form that we've developed that's based off the COVID form. It just recently underwent some edits. And what we do is we work with our local health departments to get pretty much the same information that you would normally get for a COVID form. We get the traceback information from DEC and agriculture markets. We would enter that into our case report form. And then if DEC or FDA counterparts need a copy of that case report form, we would then provide it with them that's redacted. So this is basically a general process of how the Vibrio communication of a Vibrio case works in New York State. Are there problems with it? Yes, we've been seeing a lot of issues with some of our Vibrio investigations, and I can go over some of those now before I go into more details of some of the other outbreak data. But, one of the things we've been finding issues with is people don't remember what they ate. Some of you may be, shocked, or maybe you're not shocked, but we just had a recent case that told us that they had raw oyster Rockefeller. And I'm trying to think of myself, well, I know what oysters Rockefeller are, and I've never had a raw oyster Rockefeller. Is there really a restaurant putting out raw oyster Rockefeller? And we looked at the menu, and no, it says it's cooked. We try to get a hold of the case and get interview of the case and try and find out what the case, actually ate. And sure enough, no, it was cooked, but they also had lobster that was in a lobster roll, and they also swam. So, it's interesting what we find out when we kind of dig a little deeper. The other issue, one we were dealing with recently too, is somebody that said they had, raw oysters at a restaurant with 3 of their friends. The restaurant doesn't serve oysters. So then it's trying to find out, okay, we got to interview this person again. And now you're at the third time you're trying to interview them and they don't want to cooperate, and or they're not answering the phone, or now they realize, oh, maybe I didn't eat oysters. And sometimes they're embarrassed that they don't know the difference between an oyster and a clam. So that's always an issue. Some of you may be shocked that, we've investigated outbreaks where, I know DEC won't be shocked because they know about this, but where there was raw mahogany clams served at a clam bake, or whatever you want to call it, at a facility. And I've seen mahogany clams. I very rarely want to eat them cooked, let alone raw. But those are some of the issues that we deal with. So it's very interesting in trying to get the information out of people on what they accurately ate and what they accurately consumed. So this slide here looks at specific contributing factors that we identified by etiology associated with seafood outbreaks. So here, if we look at the first contributing factor of a natural toxicant, a majority of our outbreaks associated with a natural toxicant that were seafood related were scombrotoxin. The other ones were ciguatera-toxin. Now, when we're dealing with consumption of orally heated animal origin, we often see that with Vibrio perihemolyticus. We also saw that with some salmonella outbreaks, as well as with some norovirus outbreaks, and those were often associated with raw shellfish. Contaminated ingredients were often associated with Vibrio perihemolyticus, as well as salmonella and norovirus as well. Where we saw outbreaks with, an unknown contributing factor, those were often associated with calicivirus or norovirus outbreaks, as well as with salmonella. Outbreaks with inadequate refrigeration were associated with scombrotoxin. We've seen that often. Obviously, we know that there's an issue with keeping foods at proper temperatures when we see scombrotoxin. Vibrio perihemolyticus, where it's allowed to proliferate. And then outbreaks associated with the infected person. We had a norovirus outbreak. If I remember that one correctly, it was likely some form of sushi being handled by an infected worker. And that's why we have an infected person and the hand contact with implicated food were likely the same outbreak. So looking at this time period overall, not specific to seafood anymore, but our overall findings, we took these different time spans here, 2002 to 2006, 2007 to 2011, 2012 to 2016, and 27 to 2021. So looking at those 5-year averages, the total number of foodborne outbreaks we're seeing during this time span is on a decrease. We are seeing a reduction in our number of foodborne disease outbreak over the years. Agent identification, luckily, has improved since 1999, and we're seeing an increase in our ability to identify the foodborne disease etiology associated with these outbreaks. And I think that's all that I had. So just some acknowledgement here. I'd like to thank a lot of the CDC team that I work very closely with, as well as our federal partners, USDA, CDC, and FDA, our local health departments, the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. If I did not make it clear, our foodborne disease outbreak data does include New York City data. New York City does report their foodborne disease outbreak data to us. We do report their foodborne disease outbreaks to New York State. However, we do not report their cases to CDC. We report their outbreaks to CDC, but not their cases. I'd like to thank other New York State Department of Health staff, two of my colleagues that are on this, helped with this presentation at Concha, Cadam, and Shannon Kilburn, and then our wonderful staff at Agriculture Markets. And I should have New York State Department of Environmental Conservation on here. I know I mentioned you several times. I don't know where that got missed, and I apologize for that. And our New York Integrated Food Safety Centers of Excellence. So I want to thank all of you. I think this was an old acknowledgement slide that got put into this one. But thanks, everyone, and I've got plenty of time for questions.
Great. Thank you, David. So while folks think about questions, there is one in the chat, and I'll read that out for you and the rest of the group. Thank you for the excellent presentation. When you arrive at questions, if you have time, can you speak to people who get sick after eating white tuna sushi or escalar, a fish frequently mislabeled as white tuna in sushi restaurants? Is this common, and do all people become impacted equally when consuming this fish?
So Escalar, we very rarely get outbreaks associated with it. And that's the oily diarrhea, right? And sometimes it's often, what's the diarrhea called? I want to say cararrhea, I believe is a proper term for it. But it's that oily diarrhea. We've gotten reports of it where we've had to work with agricultural markets in DC to actually do trace back on the fish to see if it was what it was. And I'm trying to remember earlier on whether or not we've done speciation or try to determine it. And I thought we used maybe FDA's lab to determine if that type of fish was actually served at the establishment. Um, but does it happen? Yes. It is rare. We don't see it often. I think I only remember my 20 plus years here, maybe one outbreak or so that we've dealt with, where it implicated Escalar. But I think we haven't seen it as much. One thing, I know since this was a great question, I hopefully I answered it. But when we do encounter those, we try to get as much information as we can, especially invoices. We try to get pictures. When people are complaining of that oily diarrhea, we send the local health department to the restaurant to get that information, to get pictures. Even if we can't test it, we try to get a sample and see how it's labeled to see if we can get one of our other partners to do the testing or see if they're involved. But in addition to that question, some of the other, that reminded me of some of the other rare diseases that we also see and get involved with. We've had on occasion outbreaks or reports associated with HAF disease and the development of rhabdomyolysis and, people that consume buffalo fish. The other issue that we've seen is, puffer fish. Somebody thought that they had symptoms and, because they caught puffer fish and they prepared it, they knew what they were doing or didn't know it was poisonous. And we hear all sorts of stories where we've had to follow up on incidents of those. But yes, we've seen some reports of Escalar. We do work closely and try and get as much information as we can to determine if that was a likely source.
Great. Thanks, David. We do have another question. So have DEC, DOH, or Ag and Markets investigated use of electronic systems for tags that could be operated from a phone app as a great way to centralize information for collection when needed? Also easier for operators to use while in the process of harvest to keep records up to date. I don't know, that might be more of a DEC question.
Yeah, I'm not aware. I mean, it sounds great and it's probably similar as we're going to be, but I don't know if Mark or Deborah are on from DEC that might be able to address that.
Right. Well, feel free to unmute if you would like, DEC, Mark or Debbie, but we can open up for more questions if anybody has them. Also, feel free to unmute at this point to ask your question if you'd like to ask verbally.
Uh, this is Mark with the DEC. There are some programs out there that the tags are computed off off a computer. They have a tracking system and stuff, but it's not that widespread. It is being discussed at the ISSC about instituting some kind of program. One problem with it is especially in the shellfish industry, it's such a diverse set of companies from like a one-man operation up to really large dealers. Some are basically still paper and pencil, some are using computers, but it's coming out there. I don't know of anything that's really been instituted widely outside of there's one program called New Trace that you're seeing more and more. That's the only one I'm really aware of.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
And I can say there you might see increased digitization of this data with the new FSMA 204 traceability rule and all the requirements coming down, even though shellfish are not required to comply with that because of the existing traceability requirements with shellfish. There's an increase in advancement in software and technologies for traceability, so that may see an increase and provide more opportunity for that. But kind of like Mark alluded to, our industry is fairly small, oyster industry, and that investment in the digitization and that technology can sometimes be a hindrance. Barry, did you have more to add on that?
No, I had a separate question.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thanks, David. Very interesting. I was curious if you could provide some context for like a situation. This happened a couple of years ago. Someone got sick from Vibrio, but it was actually from an open wound while being in the water. And at the time, it got linked to oysters. I think it was actually Connecticut based. But I was curious how that process, would that be similar to the process that you would go if it was from contaminated food? Or I guess I'm just curious how it would be different or similar.
So if it was an open wound, I'm not sure how it got linked to oysters, because we
I think it
normally,
was from the media, actually. The media made the link, not necessarily.
yeah, which we know what the media tends to do with things. But what happens, it's very similar, and to that process that that I've showed over here, and I'll pull that up again real quick. Where was it? So basically, when we find out about those, you have a sick person that went to their doctor, and they get tested. And usually when it's from an open wound, it might be, something from that particular wound infection that got tested. And then they find out that, hey, this person has Vibrio. Maybe it'll get speciated. Well, it's Vibrio parahemolyticus or Vibrio bonificus, or, what species they have Vibrio. So with a wound infection, we would still ask, and everyone gets interviewed with that same questionnaire. The CDC standard is the COVIS form, which has questions in there about recreational water exposure, as well as shellfish or seafood consumption. So how that normally happens is when that person gets interviewed, we find out, well, you have an open wound. Did you swim in any brackish waters? Where did you swim? Where have you been the past 7 days? And that's where they might have found out when they asked them where have they been the past 7 days, that they were in some, ocean or doing recreational swimming in the state of Connecticut. And that's pretty much how, that would happen. And then information would get shared with CDC and with other states, because to see if they have other cases that may have been in the same areas or that same water, or may have swam in that same water. So yes, it is pretty much done the same way, because we are using the same questionnaire. We are gathering some of the same information, but if it's not shellfish, we're not going to be looking for a trace back on food items. We want to find out, where did this person get exposed? Where was their open wound likely exposed to brackish waters or other form of waters? Sometimes, we get these wound infections where people are actually harvesting their own shellfish and may cut themselves on a rock or cut themselves on something in the water, and now got Vibrio from, having an open wound while in that type of water. So yes, the investigation is very similar. The process is similar. The same questionnaire is used, but hopefully we're not attributing them to open wounds to shellfish if they had no shellfish consumption.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. So I'll note Kate in the chat mentioned that Ag and Markets is working on launching a Salesforce project, and the license includes a lot of those features linked back to the digitization of the trace back and data. Would love to have cross-agency collaboration. So if you're interested, Kate's email is in there if you want to talk more about it. Then we have another question from Debbie. Have you investigated any Campylobacter illnesses associated with oysters that could have been impacted by bird waste? They've seen recent outbreaks in Maine, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, and it's becoming an emerging issue with the ISSC.
So if we have our colleagues at DEC would get brought in right away. We're not investigating any that we know of at this time, but we've had outbreaks of shellfish associated with Campylobacter in the past. And I remember, one particular large clam provider in New York State where they had these big clam events where Campylobacter was the implicated item. I mean, it's interesting. I don't remember or recall, Debbie, where those, where those were traced back to, but I'm wondering if those clams might have come from areas that may have been impacted by bird waste. Because it's definitely plausible that it could happen. I know there was a lot of issues when we were doing that investigation because, people were assuming, well, they must have cross-contaminated with chicken because how does shellfish get contaminated with Campylobacter? But we've had outbreaks of, shellfish associated with Campylobacter. Unfortunately, our lab couldn't test the shellfish for Campylobacter. But we know we had, Campylobacter in the people. We know that was a food item they ate. For some people, all they ate were raw clams or, raw shellfish. I can't remember if it was clam specifically, if it was oyster specifically, but we know it was raw shellfish. And yes, I'm sure it's out there. It'll be interesting, what we find and how the ISSC is gonna try and deal with it. If there's more testing we can do at our labs to demonstrate that, I think that would be key. I mean, who knows what resources we're going to have now and in the future. But I think that's one resource we definitely need is that lab capacity to test our different food items for these different pathogens to actually prove that, the food item can get this pathogen from the environment. I think would definitely be helpful.
Great. Thanks, David. Any other questions for David? All right, well, we'll stick around a little longer. If you have questions that come up, feel free to put them in the chat, raise your hand, unmute. I've put a link in the chat now to an evaluation for today's session. Please take a minute to complete that, give us some feedback about today's session and also some insights as to what you might like to hear more about in future office hours. If there's any other questions, we'll be here for another couple minutes. But thank you all for participating.